Could you become fluent in a language by watching a single film enough times? To find out, I decided to watch Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse 50 times in Spanish, and in this video, we'll get to see a before and after of my Spanish when I talk to a native speaker. The power of repetition when learning a language is undervalued, especially repetition in listening. If you've ever tried to learn a language, you've probably been told to just start speaking, but this is not how we learn languages. Through this experiment, I want to show you 3 things. 1. You learn a language by first understanding it. 2. You can understand a language much faster when you listen to something on repeat. 3. When you combine those 2 things, you can learn a language much faster by doing something like this. Tjena chicos, but before we deal with any of that, we need to deal with the question that I'm sure some of you have, which is, why Into the Spider-Verse? Why not a film that is natively in Spanish? And there are a few reasons for that. Firstly, if you're going to watch something 50 times, you need to make sure that it's something not just that you like, but something with enough attention to detail that you can pick out something new every time you watch it, and Spider-Verse fits that description perfectly. I could literally talk about this film for days, but to give you an idea of the level of detail that we're talking, it worked out to roughly 1 week of an animator's time per second of film. Now, there may be some Mexican or Latin American films out there with that much detail, but I wouldn't know what they were. The advantage of picking something that you know you can do this with straight away outweighs the downside of it being a voiceover. But the other thing about animation is that there's arguably no original language to an animated film. Yeah, there's the one the script is in, but whether you watch it in English, Spanish, Dutch, or Turkish, you're hearing the performance of a voice actor. Along with most of Latin America, when I think of Miles Morales, I don't think of Shamik Moore, I think of this guy. But arguably the biggest benefit of my picking this film is that I already had a few viewings under my belt, maybe 3 or 4. This means that even the very first time of the 50 that I watched it in Spanish, I already knew what was going on. My Spanish wasn't good when I started doing this, but I had started learning Spanish already. I never really picked Spanish as a language I'd be interested in, but there was a weird day in November last year where a few things came together to sort of tell me that I should maybe learn Spanish. How I personally got started with Spanish at that time was with StoryLearning, who this year is having their first ever summer sale, which is 50% off all 11 of their beginner courses and their intermediate courses. StoryLearning is exactly what it sounds like. You do learn words, phrases, and some of the basic principles, how letters are pronounced, etc., but the bulk of your time is spent properly getting to know the language in a natural setting, in a story, and your brain is very good at latching onto story, which I'm going to talk about more in this video. And it's a great way to learn, because you might think that you can't read a story in a new language, but it's actually the opposite. When you're taught the minimum that you need to know in order to follow the story then becomes your teacher. And I know that this works because I was able to get through the Spanish beginner course from day 1 of my learning Spanish. It was actually part of my decision to take up Spanish officially because it was so doable. And each course is properly curated. So in French, Spanish, German, etc., allowances are made for the obvious similarities to English, whereas in Japanese, Mandarin, and the like, it's adjusted so that you're not totally lost and you can actually use the story to learn. And all of that is currently 50% off for about 4 days, and I know you hear people say that all the time, but this is a real 50% off, and it really will end on Monday night USA time, so don't delay. Check out the links in the description for that. Whether you're a beginner or an intermediate learner, it's a great way to start or level up your language skills before you take the obvious next step of watching an animated Spider-Man film 50 times in a row. And that brings me to the main thing that I want to get across, which is that you learn a language by first understanding it. Generally, people think that in order to speak a language, you need to spend a lot of time speaking it. And unfortunately, there is some truth to that. Now, I say unfortunately because for decades now, people have been taking that some truth and preaching it as the whole truth, with statements like, "The only way to get better at a language is to speak it," or "The fastest way to learn a language is to start talking to native speakers." Neither of these statements is entirely false, but they're both missing a big piece of the puzzle, and I'll show you with this experiment.
I'm telling you, man, it's science.
Without replaying this part of the video, remember and repeat the following words in the same order that I say them. You can pause after I finish to try that. The waitress, on the other hand, had spent her entire life thinking about how she would take revenge on the men who'd killed her father when she was a girl. I would guess that most of you were able to recite that perfectly, if not pretty closely. Now a shorter set of words, try to do the same thing. Råd, växa, slott, tillfällig, byxor, godkänt, insatser, otrolig begagnad. My guess is that even allowing for pronunciation problems, anyone watching who doesn't understand Swedish would only have been able to repeat one or two of the second group, if any at all. The first group was 30 words, the second group was 9, but which was easier to remember? Obviously the first one, but not just because it was in English. The Swedish speakers can let me know, but I'd bet that even they found the first one easier because the second one was just random words with no inherent connection. Assuming you speak the language well, remembering 9 words in a row is possible for some people some of the time, but had I have continued like that for another 21 words, the only people who'd have any chance of correctly reciting all 30 would be people who'd developed some kind of system for remembering words. That system would likely be linking them in some kind of story. The same technique is used to remember long strings of numbers and the order of cards in a deck. This is because meaning is easier to remember than anything else. The first sentence conveyed a meaning, and a strong one at that. Had the sentence have been describing a room, we'd have struggled to remember it as clearly because not all meanings are of equal importance to us. Okay, so I've shown that it's easier to remember things that mean something than it is to remember random things. Big deal. That doesn't prove that we learn languages best by first understanding them. But consider for a minute that those 9 words I said before have meanings that Swedish speakers do understand. They're hard to remember because they're out of context, but they're all real words that do mean something. But assuming that you don't understand Swedish, you couldn't obtain that meaning. So it wasn't that they weren't real words or didn't carry any meaning, it was just that the meaning they did carry was lost on you. My point here being that comprehension enables meaning. No comprehension, no meaning. Now going back to the English sentence, you didn't even consider that you had understood it. You just listened to the meaning, and when you said it back to me, you didn't recall the words. Yes, you said the words, but how you did that was not to remember each word in order. No, you just accurately recalled what meaning had been conveyed. And because of that, the words just followed in the order that you know to convey that meaning. So you comprehended it automatically, and that comprehension enabled meaning. And from that meaning, you were able to remember the right words in the right order. And when you're remembering something in order, whether it's music, a chess sequence, a sentence, a specific set of muscle movements like changing gear in a car, anything, you're really remembering how it goes, right? And in all of those examples, including sentences, there are general patterns to how everything goes. In sentences, some words just don't go in some places ever, whereas other words have to go in certain places. Some words can go in different places among the same set of words, but when they change position, the meaning of the sentence changes with them. So do you think it would be faster to experiment with all the possibilities of what words could go in what order and how that affected the meaning by speaking to native speakers and asking them to give you feedback on everything you said? Or would it be faster to just listen to how native speakers use the language and start deducing the patterns for yourself? It's the latter, of course. That's not to say that it happens overnight. It takes a lot of exposure, but if you get enough of the language running through your brain, you'll start noticing that when they express certain meanings, they do that with certain words in a certain order. But you'll also have questions. You'll be wondering why, when they talk about something that is far away, that thing seems to change its form slightly. Or sometimes it might sound like they're using the past tense when the present would be more logical. Whatever it is, you'll start formulating a hypothesis without ever even consciously deciding to, and you'll start checking that hypothesis against every occurrence of whatever it is that you've noticed. I'm deliberately not being specific with my examples because it will greatly depend on the person, the language in question, and how much exposure they've had to it, but that brings us to why you'd watch one movie 50 times. Wouldn't it be more worthwhile to watch 50 different movies? And the answer is, for an AI, yes, but for a human language learner, and especially one more towards the beginner end of the scale like myself, no. Because remember I said every occurrence of whatever it is that you've noticed. Well, noticing things doesn't happen immediately. Into the Spider-Verse is a masterpiece, so I do for your sake hope that you've seen it. But even if you've seen it 6 or 7 times, I guarantee you that there's something I've noticed about it that you haven't. For example, you may not have noticed that when she's giving the physics lecture here, she's on a bicycle. Is that a reference to Einstein and his bicycle analogies? Or is it just so that Miles can point her out later? She also seems to lose control of the bike when the teacher pauses the video, as if the act of pausing the video affected her in the past. I think this may be a reference to the quantum theory that she's talking about, about. Notice also that Miles says maybe he's not late and the rest of them are early, which in Gwen's case is literally true. Miles also writes the date as Decembuary, which may refer to a number of things. All of this is just scratching the surface. I could name hundreds more, obviously, but my point is that repetition leads to noticing things, and it's the same with language. It's the same with anything. If you were able to notice every piece of language and how it was used in every line of the movie on a single viewing, then sure, watching 50 different movies would definitely be better. But no one's that perceptive. And this is where watching one movie 50 times intersects with comprehensible input. Do you think that it would be fair for me to say that I completely understand every idea that is being expressed in this film? I do think that's fair. I mean, there may be a Spanish word or line here or there that I'm not completely understanding, that I maybe am not picking up properly, but I still know the idea that the character is supposed to be expressing in that particular moment of the film. So I'm not wondering what's happening anymore. So basically, I've made the entire film comprehensible through massive repeated exposure, and everything left in it, all this stuff, is just input. So this whole film that is acted by and for native speakers has become comprehensible input to me by virtue of the fact that I've noticed every piece of language in it. It was interesting to me that only after about 30 times it started to become so comprehensible that there's not really an adjective to properly express what it was, because it doesn't feel fair to call something that you know almost by heart comprehensible. Like, imagine someone showing you your own address and asking you if you understood it. It's like, technically the answer is yes, but is that really the whole answer? And that is the case for me with most of the lines from this film.
Siempre hay una llave de bypass, llave de virus, llave de no sé qué, siempre se me olvida y las llamo Goober. Dámelo.
There was a good example of this when I was in Mexico with one of my friends and a bunch of his friends whom I didn't know. And the details are kind of irrelevant, but he just got drenched in sweat. We don't know why. He was doing the same thing as us, the same heat. They'd all noticed and they were kind of looking at him like, dude. But when I noticed, without even thinking about it, I was just like, ¿por qué sudas tanto?
¿Y por qué sudas tanto?
And there were a few situations like this when either words or whole lines from both Spider-Verse and Rango that I either needed to understand because they were said to me or I actually needed to say, they were just like saying my address.
I'm from the west. Out there, beyond the horizon. Past the sunset. The far west.
And on those particular occasions, which I'll admit were not numerous, I genuinely felt as fluent in Spanish as I am in English. Now, of course, fluency is more than just one response, one line, one whatever.
¿Y tú qué?
But it was still kind of cool that even just a couple of times a day, I could know for certain that that one thing that I'd said or heard did mean what I knew it to mean, if that makes sense. There are things from both films, but especially Spider-Verse, that I could not unlearn if I tried. Even if I never learn Spanish again, I think in 30 years I'll still know, okay, hagamos esto una última vez. But really the question for the comprehensible input learner is, does this help you to comprehend the whole language faster? Because obviously there are still going to be gaps after watching just one film 50 times, or even watching 10 films 50 times each. But what we need to know is how much easier and more effective does watching other films become after watching that one film repetitively. I think that unless you're already upper intermediate, like even approaching basic fluency, then watching that one film 50 times before watching another 50 films once each would be even better than taking those same 50 films and watching them twice each. Because while there is of course value in the second viewing, I would say that in less than about 20 to 30 times, you don't get to that event horizon where the script becomes so ingrained that you can analyze it even when you're not watching it, which I can with this film. I had numerous moments where the language would pop into my head fully formed because it at least partially matched what I was seeing. So I had this one morning where my son, he's 2, he walked into the room wearing this, and I had this really weird feeling where what I was feeling about the situation and the words that ran through my head immediately were not at all the same, and I was completely aware that the two things were mismatched, and it was kind of like I could feel two things at once by having the feeling and the language be separate. So what I was feeling was, oh, look, he's so cute in his little mask. But the words that were in my head were automatically, without even thinking about it, ¿Qué haría yo si fuera yo? Lo tengo.
¿Qué haría yo si fuera yo? Lo tengo.
And this would happen all the time with other lines that I didn't even realize that I knew. But then for some reason, explicable or not, those lines would just pop into my head so well formed that I could study the Spanish contained within them as if I were reading examples from a page. But this only started happening after almost 40 viewings. In case you're wondering, no, I didn't spend the full 100 minutes watching this film every single time, because on around my 10th viewing, I cut it down to just its dialogue. Now, if you weren't doing this for the sake of a video, you could then make an MP3 out of that and take it with you in the car or to the gym or whatever. I was watching it every single time, but most of the time I was watching that abridged version, which is around 49 minutes. So most of my viewings took 50 minutes, but I also got to love it so much that every so often I wanted to watch the whole thing uninterrupted because it's just so freaking cool. And yes, I figure people will ask this. I have seen the sequel twice already. I love it almost as much as the first one. In fact, when it comes available on streaming platforms in different languages, I may do this again. Now, I do want to make it clear that this is obviously not the only thing that I did that helped my Spanish in any way. I was in Mexico for almost 9 days, and I have started working on a video about what difference I think it makes to be there in person, but I didn't actually get to speak that much Spanish while I was there. And although a few months ago I did make it sound like I'd have all of February and March to be hitting Spanish for 4 or 5 hours a day, the reality of preparing for an overseas trip whilst meeting all of my normal uploads and everything else meant that for most of those 2 months I got much less Spanish than I'd hoped for. In fact, that was what inspired me to do the super long live streams in which I learned Spanish. I knew that unless I did that, I would be going to Mexico with the same crappy Spanish that I'd had since the start of the year. It was also what made me decide to get through Spider-Verse 50 times. I find challenges like this interesting in their own right, and honestly I wish I had the time to do more extreme stuff like this or immersing for a week straight and that kind of thing. So yeah, there were definitely other influences on my Spanish, but this film makes up for the vast majority. Like since the before conversation until now, I would say that this film makes up for at least 60% of my exposure to Spanish.
Y hablando con ustedes, bienvenidos todos.
This is Andrea la Mexicana from Dreaming Spanish. We spoke over Zoom a few days ago, and this was my first time speaking Spanish since I was in Mexico 2 months ago. Bear in mind that while it's very easy to make your language skills seem much better than they are by preparing things to say, editing down to just the best bits, or both, it's also easy to make your language seem much worse than it is by putting an unedited conversation right in the middle of a video like this one. Any conversation between two people over the internet would seem slow, clumsy, and inarticulate when compared with a scripted, edited video. For example, this is Andrea and I talking on a live stream 3 months ago. Para mí, hablo inglés, es mi idioma es mi lengua materna, y hablo sueco, un nivel Here's some of our recent conversation. ¿Sí? ¿Me escuchas?
Perfecto, sí.
Esta conversación es por mostrar mi nivel de español en español después de visar una película 50 veces.
50 veces, wow. Ok, ¿y estás grabando ahora?
Así.
Oh, hola.
Hola. ¿Sí? This conversation was not in the slightest bit prepared. There were even topics that I meant to bring up but completely forgot about because Andrea mainly wanted to know about my time in Mexico. Hay mucho trabajo que hacer y entonces ahora México, especialmente México, me sentió como
¿Un sueño?
Un sueño, sí, gracias.
Sí.
Sí, sentió como un sueño pasado, no. Discussing Mexico was much more difficult than some other things are for me and doesn't really paint my Spanish in a good light, but that's okay, because the whole thing about the language acquisition process is that taking a short-term view of it, it appears not to work at all. For example, I completely forgot the word for to happen, which is the one Spanish word that just about everyone knows, pasar.
¿Qué pasa, my friend?
No una cosa que realmente hecho, que I know this is going to sound crazy, but this is actually a good example of the acquisition process working and being entirely different from the skill building or classroom learning process. Anyone who's ever studied Spanish for more than one day knows how to say happen, so why did I forget it? Because I wasn't thinking, what's the word for happen? I was thinking in Spanish, and in my little experience speaking Spanish, I just haven't really had to think about the idea of things happening before. And therefore, while trying to express that concept, it was like reaching into an empty bag until I did remember an example of it being used, and then it was easy. Esto no me pasa en el sueco. A veces, no frecuentemente. Had I have ever stopped to think, I want to say the Spanish word for the word happen, I would have remembered what it was, but the process that I'm currently in the middle of bypasses that translation phase, and because of that, it seems slower. Progress is haphazard and sometimes even appears to go backwards, but after a time, acquisition leaves skill building in the dust, as the capacity for thoughts that occur in the language grows and grows, whilst skill builders always have to think, how do I say X? How do I say Z? Is this the subjunctive? The long-term comprehensible input learner seems to have the thoughts in the language itself. Now, I'm not a long-term learner, but here's an example of it working. If you ask anyone how to say thank you in Spanish, they'll tell you it's gracias, obviously.
Gracias, amigo, gracias.
And that's what I would say too. But here I am saying I want to thank you and using a different word, not because I meant to, but because that's just what came out. Primero quiero que te agradecer por asistir a esta conversación. I don't remember learning how to say this and wasn't really even conscious that I had said it until watching the recording, so it's obviously something that I understand the meaning of well enough to use without thinking. En el aeropuerto, el aeropuerto de la Ciudad de México es muy grande, ¿no?
Sí.
Y eran 2 compras y visité a una compra, compré como 6 libros. Obviously, there's still a long way to go. My Spanish is far from perfect, but I would argue that at least for certain types of people, doing something like this has numerous advantages on top of the fact that it's 50 hours of comprehensible input. It removes so much of the perceived complexity of learning a language. I never had to choose what to do in Spanish. And while you would think that it would become increasingly boring to just watch the same film over and over again, weirdly, it doesn't. It actually gets more interesting beyond about the 8th time, as it gets harder and harder to notice something that you've never noticed before. There's also a certain hard to describe comfort in knowing something that well. I think it's what makes kids always want to read the same books and watch the same movies. It's like, in their mind, there's no need for anything else. It's their favorite. Why would they want to watch anything else? And I started to feel that on about the 8th or 9th time. Up until that time, I felt that it was repetitive. But after that, I was like, I like watching this movie. It makes me feel nice. But okay, let's do this one last time. 1. Learning to speak a language involves learning to understand it. 2. Learning to understand it is much faster with a lot of repetition. 3. Therefore, you should repeatedly watch and listen to things along with mixing in new things. 4. Into the Spider-Verse and Rango are both awesome, and if you haven't seen them, you've got some catching up to do. Finally, story learning is awesome and an awesome way to learn a language. You've got about 4 days after the release of this video to get 50% off a course in the language of your choice. I'll leave links in the description. I also want to thank Andrea la Mexicana for being a part of this video. If you're not familiar with Dreaming Spanish, I'll leave a link to their channel as well. And until next time, lo quiero.
¿Qué? ¿Cómo?